Hello,
Hi, I'm Mary Thaler.
and I'm Geoffrey Edwards. Welcome back to Writing Off the Deep End.
And in this episode, we're going to be talking about writing very, very short.
So what they call flash fiction.
So the official definition is something like 500 words.
Yeah, although I did a workshop at Clarion West this summer, and they had the cutoff at 1,500.
How's the process different?
I'm a novel writer, and so writing even short stories is a challenge for me.
Yeah.
And flash fiction is like, how the heck am I going to be able to do that, Mary Robinette Cole did a presentation on writing very short fiction. It's on YouTube. She had a kind of a rough word count for introducing one character versus two characters, one plot situation versus two, and more or less you needed one character and one situation, and you maybe get it within 500 words, but if you introduce a second character, you're almost sure going to go over. I followed a formula, and I produced a flash fiction piece. It worked perfectly.
Okay.
but it was a bit recipe, and I don't like recipes.
Yeah,
so after that, I went back, and I thought, well, I'm going to go back and do this my other way.
And did that work?
Out of 6 exercises in flash fiction, I produced 1 flash fiction, which I'm reasonably happy about. I find the concept of flash fiction really difficult to get my head around. I always want to give a little bit more, I'm a world builder, and you take space to build worlds, and flash fiction, you don't have space to build a world much.
Although we've talked in our previous episode about world building, about the idea that your world continues past the frame. And I think
but every time you add in these details, you're not really writing flash fiction. You're writing a short story or a longer story of which you've given a snippet inside this flash fiction, but that's not really the concept of flash fiction. The concept of flash fiction is a kind of self-enclosed piece, right?
So the one that you wrote that was successful, what do you think about it made it successful?
Well, it was more self-contained. It didn't contain, in fact, it didn't even have a character in it. But it had a kind of implicit narrator character, right? So,
okay.
Yeah.
It sounds like it was a difficult experiment that you did. Are you tempted to continue to write them, or is this just...
No, I think I'm tempted to go back to my other stuff. But, I did
tried writing short, and now you're done.
Find it a useful exercise. It's just that I find that what I found is flash fiction, you tend to focus on a concept or a message that you're trying to get across, or a concept kind of thing. It's kind of more conceptual fiction. You can have characters and development, but you can't do much development in the word limit. Yeah. And so it kind of turns on a bit of a twist. And I find that it's not the kind of fiction I want to write that turns on a twist. I want to do character development in a more full way. And so
I'm going to disagree with you. Or at least I'm going to disagree on how you've framed it. That very conceptual. I've read flash fiction that does turn on a concept, and I do enjoy it. They're often very clever, and I like that. I've mentioned before that I think as you go from a novel to a short story and then to a poem, and I think we can maybe situate a flash fiction in between the short story and the poem in a lot of ways. What happens is you focus more on a single intense experience. So you could create something very character driven within a small space.
Obviously, I don't master that.
I think there's different ways to do it. I tend to write fairly short myself, but my natural length, and I do think writers have natural lengths, is still a bit longer than flash. I tend to write about 3,000 words is a natural short story for me. And that does give you the time to ramp up to that moment of emotional intensity. You risk pushing your reader a little bit by putting them into a situation where they have to care very quickly. On the other hand, that those poetic language
Because I understand
techniques.
poetry. I mean, I write poetry, so I don't have any difficulty with length there, but it's a very different focus.
Could you think of a flash fiction as a slightly longer prose poem with narrative?
I probably could. Although poetry isn't really about character either, not very much. It's more about an image or just a feeling or an image, right?
Mm-hmm. I think some poetry is about character.
Yeah.
And I think that there are borderlands that are very interesting. And so maybe in that way, it's interesting to think of flash fiction as one of these liminal kind of genres. It also, in a sense, if we are sitting around telling stories to each other, if we trace writing back to its oral roots, the story you tell is probably about the length of a flash fiction. And so that might be another doorway into writing very short fiction. I mean, I talked about intensity of emotion and imagery. When we tell orally, when we tell stories, we tend to strip that down.
Yeah.
And so we get that concision because we're telling a very stripped down story. But it still gets its intensity and meaning
and of course,
in other ways.
Because it's oral, the language, I mean, there are exceptional speakers, but orally, one doesn't have access quite the same extended vocabulary one does as a writer.
Yes, but you also have access to techniques such as repetition and rhythm that are very particular to oral storytelling. So, did you, were your first drafts tend to go over 500?
Well, because we were aiming at 1,500, my first drafts went over 1,500, so...
Yeah. What did you cut?
So, for instance, the one I read aloud, it had to be cut down to about 700 or 800 words in order to be fit within a 5-minute presentation window.
Wow.
So I had to take a 1,400-word story that I was reasonably happy with and trim out everything.
You went through 2 rounds of revisions.
Yes.
2 rounds of, let's not even say revision, 2 rounds of purging.
Right.
Shall we say.
Yeah.
So I am really curious, what got thrown out?
So in the original story I had, because I tend to do this, I throw in all these things about the space, like it's a character who's going towards a palace in order to rob the king, and so I had things like the people that he encountered in the streets as he went towards the palace. All that got cut.
It sounds like you moved up your starting place.
No, I didn't. I still had the same starting place, but I trimmed it right down.
Okay.
Yeah. I also had 2 kinds of sets of obstacles, and I reduced it to 1 set of obstacles in order to fit it within the time frame.
Do you think that any of the skills you learned from this experiment are now going to have an impact on how you write your longer fiction?
I mean, I think the learning about cutting in order to... Because the story in the final cut, it had power, it was an interesting story. But I felt that I cut out things that mattered to me, so if I publish the story, I'll go back and put those pieces in. What about yourself? What kind of flash fiction exercise have you done?
I've written a few very short stories, some that were under 1,500 words that I now know I'm allowed to call flash fiction, because the under 500 is extreme, and I've only tried it a few times. I find that I'm a big believer that stories are the length that they need to be, and so I think one of the most important things when you sit down to write flash fiction is that you've selected an idea, and you learn to recognize them. You can look at them and say, yep, that will take about 1,500 words to work out. And they're really just, they're rather special ideas, because most ideas need most ideas that I come up with need a little bit more, but I treasure my short ideas and I keep a little list of them for when I want to write something really genuinely short. As you say, readers do ask you for more world building all the time. And one of the things that as a author, I think I've had to struggle to decide is whether it's good to always give them what they want. I don't mean to compare, but I'm going to do it. Readers are a little bit like toddlers, and they want, sometimes they want things that aren't good for them. Sorry to my readers out there. But sometimes you want things that I don't want to give you, and you have to decide where that point is, because that leave them wanting more, leave some space for the reader's imagination. I think there are really good reasons to not fill in all the corners of your tapestry, but at the same time, you don't want people leaving you too frustrated. Maybe just frustrated enough. So, in a way, flash fiction is just taking that usual conflict down to its extremist end, and what can you get away with simply gesturing at without enraging your readers too much.
So, maybe that's enough for flash fiction for today.
Maybe we should follow our own advice and keep things short. In our next episode, we're going to have a real treat. We're going to be interviewing Eileen Wong, who is a writer from British Columbia, who works as a literary translator.
Between Mandarin Chinese and English.
So tune in, subscribe.
And see you next time. Bye-bye.